You are listening to Insurance Untangled podcast, where we explore the various challenges faced by dental practices due to their reliance on insurance. In this podcast, we dive deep into the issues surrounding dental insurance dependence and offer practical solutions and strategies for reducing your reliance on insurance. Join us as we interview industry experts, share success stories, and provide valuable insights to help you take control of your practice's financial future.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the Navigating Dental Insurance and the Insurance Untangled podcast. My name is Ben Tuinei, and today I'm the solo host in our podcast that's sort of dedicated to helping practices unwind the mess of dealing with insurance. But we also talk about other things, as you know, marketing, business strategy in general. And our main objective is just to give back to the community and present some awesome guests that have a really awesome set of experience in dentistry from the perspective of, hey, these people know how to advise. They know how to give you things in terms of next steps in different areas of your journey as a clinician or as a practice owner. So today, I have a friend of mine who I invited to this podcast named Perrin DesPortes. Perrin, how are you today, my friend?
I'm great, Ben. Thanks so much for the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you and your audience. This will be a fun conversation. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. Great to be with you.
Likewise. We were introduced by our good friend Art Wiederman out of California, as we have some continuing education there in that state coming up here in I think, springtime. So Perrin is the owner and founder of Next Level Executive. Perrin, if you don't mind sharing with our audience, how did you get started in dentistry, and what has been your journey to get to the Next Level Executive as a business owner?
Yeah, so I'm 54, Ben, and I'll try to be brief for your audience unless they're having some troubles with insomnia and need to fall asleep or anything like that. So you could say that I was born into the business. My family, extended family, owned a dental distribution company called Thompson Dental Company, headquartered in Columbia, South Carolina. The company was founded in 1899, believe it or not, and I was fourth generation in that business. I entered the business in 1995. My father was CEO and president of the company. My grandfather was chairman of the board, and it was a traditional dental distribution business. Consumables, capital equipment, technology, all, tech service, all the like. And the company had about 14 sales offices from Baltimore through Orlando, and was on the run rate to about $100 million in revenue in April of 2002 when we sold the business to Patterson. And I like to say that the reason we sold the business was not because of either financial reasons or operational reasons. The company was growing really, really nicely and was profitable. But it was sold due to poor equity transition reasons. And my father has two sisters, neither of whom worked in the business, nor did their husbands, nor did any of their children. And upon my grandfather's ultimate demise, he was 84 at the time we sold it. So kind of getting up, I guess the only thing he'd be qualified for these days is to run for president. But, outside of that, upon his ultimate demise, his estate was going to be share and share alike. So you and I might not have been math majors growing up, but we can probably figure out how 1/3 of the voting shares who operates the business, runs the business, suffers all the stresses of the business, can easily be outvoted by 2/3 of the shares when people want to get their money out. And that would have been a challenge, to say the least. It probably was not surmountable. So we made the decision to sell the business to Patterson in April of 2002. Patterson was a very good fit for us, both geographically and philosophically. I went on to run 3 different businesses for Patterson over a fairly successful 15-year career. I learned a lot about enterprise business leadership, operations, management, strategy, probably a lot of other things we can talk about today, and stayed with Patterson until about January of 2017. And, I was mid-40s at the time, was the general manager of the Charlotte operation of Patterson, and was recently married. And we had our first child, our daughter, my wife and I did at the time. And, the next step up for me in my career was either going to be moving to Minneapolis, which kid growing up in Columbia, South Carolina, just isn't built for that. Or living a life on an airplane, being a regional manager. And I didn't want to do that either. And so you repeat those things to yourself. And I also felt like I didn't have another 20 years in me to be the general manager in Charlotte. So you repeat that enough, and all of a sudden you realize it becomes a you problem and not a Patterson problem that you got to solve. And I decided to leave the company and launch a startup business called Tusk Partners that was a part consulting and part M&A advisory firm that focused in the group practice space. And we built a great business in pretty short order, helping entrepreneurial dentists grow and scale businesses, group practices. And then for those that wanted to take some chips off the table, help them exit those businesses too. My partner, DeWalker Sinha, and I spun out of that business and launched Polaris Healthcare Partners about 4 years ago, a competitor firm that basically did the same thing. So the last 8 years, I've been a full-fledged entrepreneur working with clients in the emerging group practice space around growth strategy, associate equity models, using debt funding for growth, and then exit process and transactions. And now Next Level Executive is a lifestyle business, I like to say. I got tired of living out of a suitcase and being a Marriott Bonvoy Elite member and American Airlines Executive Platinum status. That gets old really, really fast. And Next Level Executive is a group coaching model that I launched after my successful career as an entrepreneur. And I work with people who have successful practices that are thinking about adding additional locations or bringing in a partner. And it's really all the fundamentals that I've learned from a family business, from a publicly traded company like Patterson, being an entrepreneur myself, and also consulting with people building group practices. And we can dig into more of Next Level Executive, but it's I'm an army of one and an HR department of none, as I like to say. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, you have a lot of experience, Perrin. Patterson is a great organization. We have done a lot of business with them over the years. It does sound like to me that your path to get here to practice to private business ownership with what you know in dentistry, to me at least, should be an asset to a lot of people, especially surrounding, the group practice space that you mentioned. So what I was hoping to talk about today, Perrin, is sort of an industry outlook for the next decade, right? And I'm going to pick your brain about the group practice side of things, and I'll kind of have some tie-ins with insurance, things for doctors to consider. So we'll kind of attack it from both angles. And the first question I have for you is this sort of trend of consolidation that's going on in the industry. You have group practice, you have emerging group practices that are trending across the country, and that's been trending for a long time now, at least for the last decade. A lot of doctors are getting into the group practice space. And then, of course, you have the rise of private equity. When I started in dentistry way back in 2007, the group that I worked for, it was so easy for them to raise $50 million for that DSO effort. In fact, they raised that in less than 2-3 months, and then you had all these warnings back in 2007, 2008, and 2009 that there's going to be a roll up of dentistry private practices like we saw in medical. We call it consolidation these days, but that hasn't really happened. What's happened is an emerging space of DSOs, especially small DSOs. But what do you have to say about the outlook for the next decade as it pertains to the trending area of consolidation in dentistry?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ben, and it has. I mean, like you say, you can attack this from a lot of different angles, right? So let me try to be coherent and thorough, but also not boring in my response. Healthcare services practices, be they dentistry, ophthalmology, or otherwise. My wife's a retired ophthalmologist, but healthcare service businesses are at some degree much like many other businesses in that you can gain economies of scale through size and might. I mean, you see this in dental distribution, for example. You see it in banking. You see it at Lowe's and Home Depot with hardware businesses. I mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The models are all slightly different, but the principles are the same. And that is when we achieve some level of of size and scale. We get efficiencies, hopefully, in the way we deliver the services or make the widget, if it's a manufacturing company. We get buying and purchasing power for negotiations, could be on insurance reimbursement, could be on cost of goods, cost of supplies, and everything in between. And then we also gain efficiencies through usually the reduction of headcount for redundant people filling redundant positions, right? And so none of that is unique to dentistry. So when people talk about the trends of consolidation in group practices, especially as it relates to private equity's interest in it, it's not surprising in the least. If you study private equity at all, you know that over the last 3 decades plus, healthcare services are always in the top 3 investment criteria in most private equity firms. All right. So they love the economies of scale. They love the physician practice model type of an approach. And there's a lot of compelling tailwinds in dentistry specifically that give it more credence from an investor thesis standpoint. So private equity is not going away. It's here to stay. That being said, I hear people talking about dentistry is going to be 80% consolidated in the next 6 to 8 years. And I just don't believe that. So for your audience that is maybe a solo dentist in a single location, or a couple of partners, or maybe a few locations, something like that, and the fear of we're all going to end up working for private equity in the next 5 years, stop it. I don't think that's going to happen at all. One of the reasons why is because when we were leading up to COVID, you see, you take COVID as like the cutting point, right? There's pre-COVID, everybody was building a group practice to sell a group practice to ring the cash register. I talked to people who were 3rd and 4th year dental students talking about the multi-location groups they were going to buy right out the chute and sell within 5 years and go buy an island in the Caribbean. I'm like, whatever the heck happened to being a dentist and changing people's lives, right? Well, that's a different soapbox I won't get on today, Ben. But what I will say is that there were a lot of people who were building businesses to sell businesses. And we came back from COVID when we had the greatest year of global M&A ever. We saw a lot of financial investors, private equity groups, rush into the space of dentistry, start offering 2 and 3 turns higher in terms of EBITDA multiple for valuation of traditional businesses. And lo and behold, there were a lot of dentists that didn't want to own a healthcare practice because they were literally scared to death about aerosolization and everything else. So you had this perfect storm of M&A activity that led a lot of people to sell their life's work for a seemingly high valuation multiple, but they only got a fraction of it in cash up front. They rolled equity into businesses that weren't very operationally sound. This is a whole conversation around operators versus aggregators. An aggregator is simply somebody that's interested, that has a bank load of money and they want to buy dots on a map, whereas an operator says, I'm going to be disciplined in what I pay for. I'm going to operate it, integrate it. I'm going to improve it. We're going to have better cash flows and greater valuation. Operators tend to do really well. Aggregators, not so much. And now that in the world of private equity, when the borrowing costs are 3- and 4-fold what they were coming out of COVID, it costs them a heck of a lot more on debt service to make the whole game work. And a lot of it hasn't worked for them. So now you've got a lot of dentists who own successful practices or small groups, and they look at their friends that sold their practices or small groups to private equity-backed ventures 3 and 4 years ago, and it didn't turn out real well for them. So now we have the discipline of these successful clinicians who own practices thinking, maybe I've got a good thing going and maybe I don't need to transact my life's work quite as quickly. Maybe I need to be more of an operator. And maybe because my practice is really strong, it might be advisable if I added 1 location of my own, or maybe a second one over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think this is the most wonderful part of the entire practice of dentistry that we can dig into deeper. But it's the people who are building from a point of stability. They're building for the long haul. They have the opportunity to possibly bring in some minority partners. And these are great cash flow businesses that can be a lifestyle business and really sustainable and built for the long haul.
That's awesome. I have your same mindset. Going back to one of the earlier statements that you made regarding, the consolidation, DSOs. The industry is going to be 80% DSO within a few years. That's exactly what people were saying back in 2009, 2010. And yes, the DSOs in terms of their market share have increased, but not anywhere close to those projections. And then the second thing, which is kind of going to lead, the next question I have for you, another thing that you said is, I can't remember, but it's tied to what I wanted to ask you next, which is sort of around this whole concept of, when we sell, what do we want? When we build businesses, when we build practices, what do we want? Do we want to build to sell, or do we want to build for the company to last? So it's the whole concept of, hey, are we trying to build wealth, or at least a fast exit, cash flow with an exit to move on to the next project? Or are you building something that's going to have more sustainable cash flow long term? What is sort of your outlook on how that's going to play out for practices in the next decade, or business owners in dentistry over the next decade? And what are sort of your thoughts in terms of the whole idea? Do I build to sell a practice, or do I build a practice to last?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it has a lot of depth to it. So let's unpack it this way for a sec. First and foremost, if for the people in your audience, if you are a clinician who owns a practice and the practice is successful, and I'm going to define successful for you here, successful being solid systems and processes. It operates consistently and generates similar output, right? Mm-hmm. Successful clinically. The likelihood is if you're mid-career, whatever mid-career means, you probably have an expanded clinical skill set if you're a general dentist. You can do some more complicated treatment, clear aligners, endo, guided implant surgery, TMD, like whatever it may be. And then successful financially, the practice probably generates for you as the owner a healthy amount of income for you and your family. So operationally stable, clinically relatively advanced and comprehensive dentistry. And the third thing would be, financially rewarding for you and your family. If that is a level of success that you've created for yourself and you are mid-career, early 40s, let's say, or 40 years old, you've got still some work ahead of you in terms of work career, right? The question becomes, how long can I reasonably assume that the cash flows out of this practice will continue unabated? Unabated could be several things. The lack of worthy competitors in my area. My patient base, what's the breakdown demographically of them? Are they going to age out? Are they aging with me? What about me? I am the business owner and I am the lead clinician, and dentistry is a very physically demanding type of a profession. So am I healthy from a musculoskeletal standpoint? You and I have been in this game a long time, and we know a lot of people who are at the latest stages of their career, and dentistry's taken a physical toll on them, right? So it's worth it to consider all of this in an environment where we have, certainly we've all seen wage escalation recently, wages being the biggest line item expense in every dental practice. They're not going down, right? Everybody's getting 10% wage increases. It's tough to keep all of them. Insurance reimbursement rates on the decline with it, so margin squeeze here. If you own a successful practice and are thinking about the next 10 to 20 years ahead of you, adding additional locations might be akin to a defensive strategy. And by that, I mean you want to go from being a clinician who owns a practice to becoming an entrepreneur who owns a business. When you own a business, the business revenue, survivability, profitability is not 100% dependent upon you. Having a practice that is 100% dependent upon you for its existence is a risky proposition to have. So when I start talking to people and they're thinking about this growth trajectory and build for exit, that was a fast ramp, right? They're trying to add 1 to 2 locations every year for the next 5 to 10 years and then take it to market. A lot of debt, a lot of personal guarantees on debt. Instead of taking out the income from the business, they're reinvesting income into the business for growth purposes. They're, struggling to recruit and retain associates. It's, kind of akin to being a hamster on a wheel. It's doggone stressful to do that. Some people are naturally inclined and hardwired to be super aggressive and fast on their growth, and they're risk takers, and that's okay. If you build a successful group practice, there will usually always be a buyer for that group practice if you want to build for exit. What I would tell you is the sexy outcome of selling a business is fraught with danger. There's a lot of risk along the way. And I've seen a lot of people take on a lot of bank loans and basically now are struggling to make the payment they're kind of indirectly working for the bank. And that's a really challenging thing for any advisor to look at and say, wow, I could look at when you had one practice and now you have 4 times as many and you got 4 times as much revenue and you got half the amount of income. Like, was this a good equation? Is this what we really wanted to build, or did you build a mess? On the other hand, if somebody says, I might add 1 practice every 5 years for the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, I might have at the end of a 20-year run a 4-location group. I'm working clinically 2 to 3 days a week. I'm working administratively 2 to 3 days a week. I might have an anchor dentist in each location, an associate, an anchor partner that's a 25% partner for a point of stability. And this is a lifestyle business that cash flows wonderfully. And if I want to sell it at the end of that, I'm confident there'll be a buyer for it. Or maybe it's an internal sale to the existing associates and maybe a couple of others. But it gives you enough size to de-risk your personal position within the business. And it also gives you some purchasing power for your suppliers from outside. And I think that's a really kind of a healthy outlook and a disciplined way of looking at a growth strategy ultimately.
That's awesome. You reminded me of what I wanted to mention with your last comment there, the first question. Speaking about this whole concept, you build to sell or build to last. I've had competitors, many of them sell out to bigger corporations. And interestingly, a lot of those former business owners have new jobs now. They're not even tied to the former business that they sold. And that's what my philosophy is: building something that's going to last. I don't want a new career. I really love what I do. So I guess, as a business owner, you have to think about those things, where the intent to sell often is to sell and still be a part of the business. But these days you sell and a lot of those businesses don't want you part of it. They change everything, right? And they just rebrand and they bought your business so they can do whatever they want. So that's interesting, your comments there, and very, very, very good insights that you shared there, Perrin. So next question is regarding this whole concept of the fundamentals of the dental practice, or at least the dental practice business model. When you think about fundamentals for a dental practice, what comes to your mind, Perrin, on what that should look like?
Yeah, and I think this is a good question, Ben, because there are a lot of dentists that create that successful practice that I mentioned earlier. From an operational standpoint, from a clinical standpoint, from a financial standpoint, and when they get to be mid-career, they get bored. Because they start kind of having Groundhog Day, where every day looks the same as the prior one and tomorrow looks like today. And they kind of delude themselves into thinking that it's easy. And sometimes they go off half-cocked and just start, buying a bunch of practices with no forethought or strategy involved with it. And those do create the mess, like I had mentioned before. But the other thing is that sometimes they start getting disillusioned with the practice of dentistry, and they want to do something else, consulting or otherwise, right? And when I look at the model that is a dental practice, it is a beautiful model if people have a frame of reference to simply appreciate it. The first thing is there are massive barriers to entry. You and I cannot go out and buy or build a dental practice, at least not in most states. We're not licensed professionals. Right there is a high barrier to entry from a competitive standpoint. So while there may seemingly be a dentist on every other corner or massive competition in the industry, et cetera, the truth of the matter is that dentistry ain't like a car wash, where you and I are just looking to find the next location with the drive count out front and we're going to pop up a car wash. We can't do that. So there's barriers to entry to becoming a dentist and owning a dental practice. The second thing is, look, and I understand that this is overly simplistic and the world is hyper competitive no matter what the profession, but more than 50% of the adult population doesn't see a dentist on an annual basis. Now, some of that's driven by access to care. We can talk ADA and all that at another podcast. But what I would say is that there is a massive segment of the adult population that is probably insured, that is not visiting a dentist except for on an emergency basis, and there's a massive untapped need. So from a consumer-driven standpoint, you've got an ample amount of potential customers out there. That's a really good thing. The third thing is, at least for general dentistry, you have typically no concentration risk. What concentration risk is, it means that you get all of your patients or all of your customers that are only one type and it's a narrow focus, or you provide only one widget to sell to them. You're one and done. If you don't want to buy my widget, I got nothing else to sell and that's it. Well, in a general dentistry practice, they do a heck of a lot of different procedures on a heck of a lot of different patients that are insured by that are employed by a heck of a lot of different companies and insured by a heck of a lot of different insurance companies. And that, from a concentration risk standpoint, really creates a nice even revenue stream across the board, where unless you're in a small town with only one employer and one insurance company, where if the mill closes down or the factory closes down, your dental practice is probably going to close down with it. That's not the case for 99% of the dental practices. So barriers to entry are high. Customer base is potentially prolific, no concentration risk. And then the model itself, from a blend of fixed and variable costs, is wonderful. You have a reasonable degree of fixed costs. Think, wages, even though that's technically a variable cost. You and I aren't accountants either. So we're just going to consider our team. We're not going to lay off our team every other week when we need to flex up and down. So I treat them like a fixed expense. And then there's rent and a handful of other things. But once you generate revenues in excess of the fixed costs, now you're in the variable world, where really about 50% of every additional revenue dollar should drop to the bottom line. And that gives us the opportunity to reinvest in marketing and expanded clinical skill set, maybe a part-time associate, open the facility more days and hours, and we can grow the top end of the revenue that should, at least in theory, grow the bottom end of the profitability at a dramatic rate without increasing our costs nearly as much. And if you take all of that in the aggregate and you just look at it objectively and say, this is a business that does all of that, if you were a first-year MBA student, you would say, where can I go buy one of those? I want to get me in that business, And unfortunately, again, you and I can't. But that's a merit of the model that I just think that far too often people lose sight of, because we all have periods of downturn and frustration and everything else. Welcome to life, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, that's awesome, Perrin. You'd mentioned some of the things that I had in mind in terms of fundamentals of a dental business model, but you also covered some of the advantages of the industry in general, right? And when you think about the advantages of the industry, especially if you're looking to build a group practice, are there other things that you want to point out?
Yeah, I think as it relates to building group practices, I think the key thing is, at least in the emerging group space, the beginning group space, the 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, let's not scale chaos. If we're going to buy practices, it's the little secret is here. It's usually less about what you pay for it and more about what you can do with it after you acquire it. So everybody gets hung up on the purchase price, and don't get me wrong, it matters. They're going to personally guarantee the loan, so the purchase price absolutely matters. But what matters more is a couple of things you can do to take some aspect of cost out of the business, or a couple of things you can do to grow the revenue line of the business. Bringing in additional associates to open additional days and hours gives a tremendous lift to it. But just trying to do it in a methodical way where you don't pursue a growth strategy too aggressively and really end up burdened by too high a level of debt. You still have to have peace of mind. One other thing, and we can talk about this if you want, but when people start to build group practices, their role in the business is usually changing. If I'm the founder, I'm usually the largest clinical producer. If you're going to build a group practice, you're probably still going to be working clinically, but the number of days might start to diminish because you have to take on an added administrative role. In Next Level Executive, I talk with the people about this all the time, about how their role changes as the business evolves. And sometimes they're not aware of that and they're not predictive of it. And as your role starts to change and you have to backfill behind you, most people take an income hit to do it. And it is predictable, it's quantifiable, but we really need to be out ahead of that to prepare for it so that it doesn't put us in conflict with our family when we're not bringing home as much income. So there's a lot of tactical aspects of building a group practice and gaining some level of economies of scale, be it cost of supplies, cost of lab, professional services, marketing services, and branding, and all that kind of good stuff. But you don't have to have 10 locations to start to realize some of those benefits. And I think if done methodically, you can still have a great degree of control over the business with a diminishing level of risk.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So in talking about all of this here, Perrin, if you were a dentist faced with the decision on building a practice, what would you do in today's market? And knowing, sort of understanding the outlook for the next 10 for the next decade, 10 years, how would you go about this whole path of practice ownership?
Yeah, if you're so smart, what would you do, genius? Right? Yeah, I get it. So I am a huge fan of what I call the large footprint solo practice, and I was just talking about the merits of the model and everything just a few minutes ago. If your audience is still awake at this point, at least, so when we think about a traditional general dentistry practice, in a lot of markets that could be 3 or 4 or 5 operatories, and I would tell you that a practice that has 3 or 4 or 5 operatories has inherent limitations on it. There's just almost no way to accommodate multiple providers, multiple doctors simultaneously in that. And with that provider risk comes a great degree of constraint involved. If you're going to acquire a practice, it always ought to be 6 or more operatories. If you're going to build one, it ought to be 6 or more operatories so that you could accommodate multiple dentists in there simultaneously. That's the first thing. So given that, what I would do, and what I like best, are when I say the large footprint solo practice, I mean a location that might have 8 to 10 to 12 or more operatories under one roof. Um, in a perfect world, I would like to have probably, call it 3 15 op type locations or 3 16 op type locations. I would much rather have that than a dozen 4 op locations. Same operatory count, one is a dramatically different business than the other. So when we think about, you know, 12, 14, 16 operatories under one roof, and I understand that this is somewhat geographically limited because you need to be super advantageous depending upon the location to have a facility that big. But what do you gain in 12 to 14 to 16 ops? Well, you gain the ability to bring on multiple associates. That's the first thing. And with multiple associates probably means that you can stay open 5 days a week or even a couple of Saturdays or a half day or something like that. You can probably figure out ways to stagger schedules to stay open instead of 8 to 5, maybe 7 to 7 or something like that, or earlier some days, later some days, to be more accessible to the prospective patient base and be more convenient around their working hours. That would be one thing. The second thing is, you get a level of volume through a business like that starts to open up the envelope for specialty treatment. Think more advanced oral surgery, more advanced endo, orthodontic treatment, things like that. Now if we could somehow string together a couple of these larger footprint practices that are 10 to 15 ops apiece, it starts to operate as if it were a 7, 8, 10 location group, of smaller size, I mean. And with that, you're able to recapture a lot of that specialty revenue. So now we can keep some of those things in-house. We gain economies of scale and efficiencies around purchasing power and potential redundancy of personnel, which means we probably don't need as many people as we otherwise would in a 10 location group. So we save some on our wages. And from an owner risk and headache standpoint, I think it's super compelling from a control standpoint. And you're never, when you build bigger businesses, you're never going to have full control of them. But man, you can have so much more control within those 4 walls versus having to go to, 10 different locations. And from a peace of mind standpoint, I think that goes a long way. So I love the large footprint solo practice, but I also love the potential, if given 15 to 20 years to make it happen, maybe acquiring a couple of other practices and merging them into a larger footprint, ending up with something like 3 14 to 16 op practices, in a contiguous area would be a really rewarding business to own and operate, honestly.
Oh yeah, I agree. My first job in dentistry was for a DSO, and the very first location that they built was collecting between $400,000 and $500,000 a month. And it was just a massive 16 operatory building and all specialists, very, very aggressive hygiene department, a huge pediatric section of the practice with an airplane in the waiting room, and play area and all that. And it did very well because it was a bigger business. But as a single office, we had a huge support staff, and we had a marketing division. We were hiring Chase bankers to deliver treatment plans and help with financing. We didn't let anybody walk out with a treatment plan, or at least an agreement for financing, or at least that was the goal, was to, if people needed something, we made it easy for them to get treatment and pay for it, and we had so much treatment plans, like so much case acceptance, so much payment plans. When you're having a banker kind of run the payment plan systems, you tend to figure out all these different dynamics of, not allowing people to not have a means of doing treatment and eliminating those barriers of entry. So that's awesome that you mentioned that. It just kind of reminded me of my beginning days in dentistry. So last question before we kind of get into your contact information here, Perrin, is what advice do you have for successful practice owners?
Yeah, I mean, well, hopefully a lot. We'll see how much of it is meritorious of their ears and attention. But first and foremost, I mean, I think just one business owner to another, be mindful of the success you've created and the opportunity you have. There's that old adage from, I think, Teddy Roosevelt, that comparison is the thief of joy. And I think all too often we as strivers and success-oriented individuals tend to look at what we don't have or what could be better on, the other side of the fence or something like that. There are a lot of successful dentists that create life-changing outcomes for patients. They make good incomes doing it, and they have a great degree of stability with their team and their business along the way. That's a really good boat to be in. And I think just sometimes we lose sight of that. The second thing I would say is, be mindful of how far you've come. Be mindful of the journey that you're on as a business owner and an entrepreneur, and be mindful of the work career left ahead of you. If you're 5 years from retirement or close to it or something, it's absolutely not worth your risk to take on more bank debt and start buying and building additional locations. Just nobody in their right mind would recommend that from a risk profile standpoint. But on the other hand, if you're mid-career, you're 40 years old or something around that age, and you've still got a couple of decades ahead of you and you've got a successful practice, you need to think objectively about how that business is glued together. What are the inherent risk variables? And probably the founder, owner, lead clinician is the biggest risk variable in it. But how sustainable is that practice and the cash flows from it over the next 20 years? And when I mentioned, building potentially a multi-location group, smaller one, and doing it methodically as a defensive strategy, sometimes de-risking our position within our business is prudent. And I think you have to be just mindful of the outlook ahead of you. The last thing I'll say is that, when you reach a level of success clinically, operationally, and financially, and maybe you start having that type of Groundhog Day that I mentioned before, you start asking yourself, what's next? And bored people make bad business decisions because they're usually short-sighted with long-term consequences. And I think as you start to transition away or evolve from being a clinician who owns a practice into more of an entrepreneur who owns a business, you need to surround yourself with good advisors, mentors, coaches, and the like, who can impart their wisdom about what's ahead for you in the journey. They're not going to always be able to tell you exactly what to do and always get it right, but usually they can tell you what to avoid because they know how it goes wrong. And minimizing missteps and just simply not making the same mistakes that everybody else does, ultimately it saves you money, but it also saves you time. And I think that's arguably the most important part. We want to build businesses that are congruent with what we want our family lives to be, not in competition with. And I see that all too often, that people start chasing the brass ring from a business standpoint, and it ends up negatively impacting their family lives. And I would never wish that on anyone. So if you can keep all of that in some degree of balance and outlook, then probably you're going to be successful in the second half of your career every bit as much as you have been in the first.
That's excellent advice there, Perrin. Really appreciate you being with us today. You've mentioned a lot of things here that at least resonated with me as a business owner. But, if I were a dentist thinking about this whole space of, the outlook over the next 10 years and how I can plan around that, as a practice owner, I think you share some pretty solid tips. So thank you for that. If you don't mind, if you don't mind sharing your email and website, maybe for the listeners, especially any of them that may want to get a hold of you to ask you questions as follow-up to this episode.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Ben. So you can find out a lot about me and about my coaching program and everything at thenextlevelexecutive.com, thenextlevelexecutive.com. I also have a podcast that you'll be appearing on at some point in the not too distant future, I'm confident of, called The Next Level Executive, and then my email address is Perrin, Perrin, at thenextlevelexecutive.com. You can find out all about the subject matter of the program, the format, workshops. There's a podcast. There's some blog content. There's a whole lot of other stuff on the website, and there's also a way to book a call with me directly off of that, or you can feel free to email me if you want to line up something. Happy to do that for anyone in your audience.
Appreciate that, Perrin. Again, check out the show notes for Perrin's contact information, his email and website. Perrin, we really appreciate and want to thank you on behalf of our listeners for such an amazing episode. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of content. And what we want to do is maybe bring you back for another 3-part series, just so that we could pick your brain more. There's a lot more questions that we want to ask you, and different topics as it pertains to your area of understanding and specialty in dentistry. So we'll have you back on for another 3-part series here over the next over the next month and a half to 2 months.
It'd be my pleasure, Ben. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a real honor and a privilege to be with you, and I look forward to the next steps for sure. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much there, Perrin. And to our listeners, thank you again for joining us on another amazing episode of the Navigating Insurance and the Insurance Untangled podcast. Stay tuned to our Insurance Untangled podcast webinars that come out every quarter. Check out the website, insuranceentangled.com, to find the links to register for those particular webinars. And then don't forget to like us on whatever social media platform, whatever podcast platform, including reviews, as that'll help other doctors that are looking for our content find it. Again, we thank you all for joining us on another amazing episode. Until next time, we wish you all the best of success. Take care.